There's no denying it, America loves guns. In fact, many would say that one of the reasons why America is so great is the relative ease of gun ownership and gun culture. Some estimates suggest that there are more guns in the US than there are people. This is a slightly misleading statistic, which we'll explore a bit more later, but if true, it would mean that US citizens should have more than enough weapons to take down the US military, right? Well, the actual answer is a bit complex, as you might expect. Let's start with some hard-hitting numbers and see if they can help determine if US citizens can hold their own against the nation's military. The US military is widely considered among the most heavily armed in the world, with a budget surpassing the next 7 nations combined and totaling over a third of how much all other nations spend on their militaries. The US is definitely the biggest military spender. This unwavering focus on improving the country's armed forces has led to the US being able to project military power far beyond its borders. As a result, the US military operates or controls at least 750 military bases spread across 80 countries. That's excluding the US itself. However, even this estimate may not be particularly accurate, with some reports suggesting that the actual number of total military bases is even higher. But this has led to an interesting paradox. You see, the US military is not the largest military in the world. More recent estimates suggest that the combined active personnel of all the branches of the US Armed Forces numbers around 1.3 million. However, this number is likely to start shrinking, but more on that later. Depending on the year you choose for comparison, there are 2 countries that have far more armed military personnel: China and India. This makes sense when you consider the country's relative populations. Both India and China have approximately 1.4 billion people, while the US has around 331 million residents as of the 2020 census, with an estimate of around 346 million people in 2024. Despite India and China having around 3.4 million active military personnel, the US is actually more militarized. That is, it has a larger portion of its residents in active military service. Even more importantly, the bases we mentioned earlier come into effect here. The US military has been estimated to have deployed over 170,000 soldiers to international bases or military campaigns abroad. This reduces the active number of military personnel in the US and North America to around 1.15 million people. Why is that number important, you ask? Let's go back to the statement we made earlier in the video. There are more guns than people in the US. Combine that with the population census and you get a staggering result. If push came to shove and US citizens decided to overthrow the government or create a widespread insurrection, they would, statistically, have access to over 300 million guns. This isn't just conjecture. Research by the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the AAPSS, suggests that there are roughly 325 million guns owned by civilians in the US, with an upper estimate of as many as 395 million. So the actual numbers are pretty close to the estimated guns-to-citizen ratio. It's also important to note that while the 2020 census suggests the American population is 331 million, the adult population is estimated to be around 255 million, giving even more credence to the idea that guns outnumber people who can use them. However, much like income and wealth, guns are distributed quite unevenly across the US. That's where the more nuanced demographics research comes into play. Also, according to AAPSS, around a third of the people who own guns in the US own only 1 gun, and the average gun owner owns 2 guns. The same data suggests that people who only own 1 gun account for only 6% of the entire civilian gun stock in the US, and people who own 2 guns add another 7%. The stock proportion continues relatively linearly for owners of 3, 4, or 5 weapons. When all is said and done, 23% of people who own 6 or more guns account for more than 68% of all civilian-issued guns in the US. Why is that important? Well, in the event of a total uprising of US citizens, over 2/3 of the guns, discounting the ones that are in shops or owned by the US military itself, would be under the control of less than a quarter of the population. But that's not all. The statistics on who owns how many guns also points us to the actual number of gun owners in the country. As you might correctly assume, not everyone owns a gun in the US, and thus a hypothetical battle, in more ways than one, between the US military and its citizens wouldn't involve everyone. Based on the same research by AAPSS, slightly more than a quarter of US civilians own a gun. Another survey conducted by Pew Research suggests that gun ownership rate might be slightly higher at around 30%. While the 5% discrepancy between the estimates is a lot, considering that it would be just over 16.5 million people, the practical results are the same. While there are plenty of guns owned by civilians, a vast majority of them are owned by a minority of people. In most scenarios, people who own multiple guns might not get to use all of them. This is compounded by the fact that people who do own multiple weapons typically store them in collections where the guns are empty and the accompanying ammunition is stored elsewhere. But let's say the countrywide uprising against the government has led to people who own multiple guns loaning or giving away their weapons to help arm a larger part of the population. How effective would that be? According to Pew Research, the pervasive gun culture in the US has led to more and more US citizens having direct experience with firing a gun, even though they don't own any. In fact, its survey suggests that as many as 70% of the US population has fired a gun before, which includes more than half of the respondents who said they had never owned a gun before. This implies that there's a significant probability the military would encounter a person who has had at least some experience handling a weapon, which would likely assist them in learning more about using them in an actual combat scenario. But there's a slight hiccup to these statistics. There's a huge variety in what types of guns and how many of them each gun-owning civilian has. For AAPSS's purposes, it's divided guns into 4 broad categories: pistols, revolvers, rifles, and shotguns. Out of these, 2 categories of weapons, pistols and rifles, account for roughly 2/3 of all guns in the country, and the other 2, revolvers and shotguns, make up the rest. Drilling down, pistols and rifles are pretty much neck and neck when it comes to prevalence among the civilian population. The AAPSS estimates there are over 113 million rifles and over 101 million pistols owned by civilians. For pistols, there's no consensus on what is the most common pistol in the country. Some of the most popular models include the Glock 19, Smith & Wesson M&P 9, M1911, and Sig Sauer P365. For rifles, the matter gets even more complicated once you delve into the subcategories of rifles that are used across the US. Semi-automatic military and hunting rifles are fairly prevalent among US civilians, with around 22 million guns distributed in each category. However, the country arguably has the most bolt-action rifles, at around 46 million, with an upper estimate of as many as 63 million of these rifles in people's homes and collections. With this in mind, recent trends suggest that sales of semi-automatic rifles, such as the legendary AR-15, have started to pick up steam, so to speak, among the gun-owning population. This is due to their reliability and increased fire rate compared to bolt or lever action models. Why is the last point so important? Well, in an actual confrontation between the US military and its civilians, the type of guns available will determine how the US military will strategize. A vast majority of people have either pistols or revolvers for personal protection. These guns become less and less useful at longer ranges and against enemies who wear Kevlar armor, such as armed US military personnel. Of course, US soldiers also carry pistols as they're convenient and don't take up too much space and weight. While they could be used in a large-scale campaign against the US government, their actual use cases in a hypothetical scenario would be minimal. Pistols are practical deterrents for home invasion and assault, not weapons of warfare and military conflict. The second most common type of guns US civilians own are, as mentioned, bolt and lever action rifles. These can be used for self-defense, but are perhaps much more common for hunting. This is mostly due to their high accuracy at longer ranges, simple design that allows them to be repaired or unjammed by relative novices, and a reliable firing mechanism. However, these rifles are also typically heavy and have absurdly low fire rates. In modern militaries, bolt-action rifles do see some use, being primarily designed for long-range marksmen and snipers, rather than direct combat soldiers, who are meant to be in the thick of the front line. This gives these historical rifles a potential advantage in combat situations that involve long-range, guerrilla-type warfare. In rural areas, the range advantage might come into play, while the low fire rate could be compensated for by the sheer availability of cover in these regions. Meanwhile, in urban areas, they could feasibly be used instead of sniper rifles. But for the latter scenario, however, the military is unlikely to give the US civilians the opportunity to take the high ground and maintain favorable sniping positions. That makes the semi-automatic rifles, one of the least common guns the US civilian owns, the most reliable, combat-worthy option that can be used in a theoretical conflict against the US military. The estimated 22 million of these weapons owned are far more than what the US military will be able to field. After all, there are only just over 1 million US soldiers who are actively serving the country and who will be called to fight against the civilians in a potential unrest. By numbers alone, 22 million rifles could be enough to give the US civilians a fighting chance. Of course, this does come with some significant caveats. First, the US military has much more than just rifles. One of the main advantages that the modern US armed forces have over its opponents is its ability to bring high-tech, reliable weapons and vehicles to bear for practically any situation. The military has access to roughly 3,500 tanks that can be deployed as part of mechanized infantry or dedicated vehicle squads, and a grand total of over 270,000 armored vehicles it can use to support the troops on the ground. Then there is also what is likely the largest and most modern fleet of fighters and multi-purpose jets in the world, giving the US military complete control over the skies of America. Of course, fighter jets are unlikely to be of much use when encountering US civilians acting as self-governing militia. To that end, modern attack helicopters such as the AH-64 Apache can make short work of infantry. The mounted 30mm autocannon fires rounds that are so powerful they don't even have to hit a human to be effective. Upon impact, a 30mm explosive round creates a shockwave up to 13 feet away that can have devastating effects on enemy infantry. The fragmentation and shrapnel from the round can inflict crippling or killing wounds to multiple people at once. And the US arsenal has even more lethal weapons such as long-range ballistic missiles capable of leveling cities. If the US military were allowed to use lethal force against its own citizens, it would be unfair to assume that soldiers would fight only with their weapons, and not the vehicles and aircraft the army possesses. Or would it? Due to the US projecting most of its military power outwards rather than on the continent, a significant portion of its equipment is stationed on ships patrolling the oceans or in bases outside the country. The insurgent force would likely have a few days to a week where they could use their large numbers and access to more guns to mount the initial strikes. If those fail to provide a satisfactory result that would end the conflict then and there, the US military could probably transport its equipment back to the country to retake the advantage and the initiative in the conflict. But you might think that the US Army using vehicles and heavy-duty artillery would be counterproductive to the concept of quelling an insurgency, and you'd likely be right. After all, the interstate highway system was designed primarily to be used by the US Army to ferry vehicles and equipment across states in the event of a global nuclear conflict against the Soviet Union back during the Cold War. It would be a significant waste of resources to destroy so much infrastructure to prevent the civilian insurgents from gaining access to vital parts of the government they want to take down. That's why the US military might not even need to bring out their vehicles and airplanes. Unmanned aerial vehicles or drones have already been used to great effect in taking down singular targets during the War on Terror in the 2000s and 2010s. The same technology and equipment would likely see use in a theoretical civil war. The proposed range of modern military drones is rated in thousands of miles, allowing the US military to strike a target practically across the country. Even worse, the drones could be deployed from offshore carriers and boats, where the civilian insurgents would have no real way to retaliate and shut the systems down. In effect, an insurgency in the US would play out much more differently than the US military's partial failure in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the Middle East, the US was forced to work under strict conditions and only brought a portion of its military equipment to use in the conflict. Furthermore, the local insurgents had the advantage of terrain being relatively unnavigable by vehicles, with mountains offering plenty of tunnels and hideaway spots where they could hide and launch skirmishes. Similarly, the US couldn't drive its vehicles into highly populated cities, as it would cause untold amounts of collateral damage and civilian casualties. But in the US, the home field advantage for the civilians practically disappears, as the soldiers would be much more familiar with the terrain and the capabilities of their own people. Another factor that comes into play is that of supply. In the unlikely event that the US military is forced to quell an American insurgency, the US civilians would likely find themselves running out of ammunition much quicker. In the War on Terror, the US military was pushed into a war of attrition because neighboring countries such as Iran or Pakistan kept sending ammunition to fuel the local insurgents. Since the US military wasn't allowed to enter those countries, it had no real way of stopping the flow of weapons and ammunition into the countries it tried to pacify. In the US, however, the situation would be significantly different. The US is a major manufacturer of weapons and ammunition, and most suppliers and manufacturers work on contracts with the US military. Of course, most of the suppliers are also owned and operated by civilians. This will likely result in domestic ammo production pretty much stopping, and both sides needing to rely on external sources of weapons. The US military will likely have considerably more resources to control the weapons trade coming into the country, and it might be able to leverage its alliance with NATO to stem the loss of domestic ammo supply in the short term. But what if the US insurgents take a page out of the Middle East playbook and try to fight in primarily urban areas? This would make the US military rely either on its numerically inferior troops and guns or on its drones for most of the combat operations. Going door to door to remove insurgents will likely make the US soldier much less effective at fighting than traditional battlefield warfare, since that would start to sound like special operations and marine purviews, something that not all soldiers are trained to perform. However, that's where the gun ownership statistics are starting to work against the US civilians. The same states that have the highest population densities, which imply large urban population centers, and large cities, are typically those that have the lowest rates of civilian gun ownership. For example, Wyoming has a gun ownership ratio of 245 guns per 1,000 people, but it has the second lowest population density after Alaska, and a total population of slightly over 500,000 people. The states with larger populations can more than make up for that. This gives a few states, Texas, California, Virginia, and Florida, a distinct fighting chance. These states are estimated to have over 400,000 civilian guns each, with Texas having over 1 million guns by itself. As such, these states are likely to be the centers of the American insurgency and share a lot of commonalities, for better or worse. They are all states with significant US military presence, particularly the US Navy and Air Force, with Virginia hosting the Pentagon. This would make them some of the primary targets for the US military to bring out the big guns to crush the insurgency before it could take control of these key points. However, there's another important question to ask. Would the US military fight against its own citizens? There are two laws that control how the US military can be deployed to respond to civil unrest in the country: the Insurrection Act of 1807 and the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. The first allows the president to direct the US Armed Forces and the National Guard to address an insurrection that prevents laws from being enforced. The second prevents the federal government from using the Army, Navy, and Air Force in place of civilian law enforcement. However, the National Guard and the Coast Guard are exempt from the Posse Comitatus Act, allowing local, state, or county governments to use them as law enforcement when needed. In fact, the US military was deployed at least 5 times in the 20th century to conduct riot control, with the most recent events being the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 and the Los Angeles riots of 1992. In both events, thousands of members of both the US military and the National Guard needed to be called in. The riots in 1968 spread across cities, requiring multiple local governments to call in their guardsmen and resulting in hundreds of people killed and thousands of arrests. In our hypothetical scenario, where a large group of US civilians aims to take down the government, the scale of the insurrection would likely be larger than any of those events, with civilians trying to remove local governments in multiple population centers. The US president could invoke the Insurrection Act and deploy the US military in response. However, the military itself is under the command of civilian leadership. The Secretary of Defense is a civilian position, and per the Department of Defense Directive 5240.01, the Secretary must authorize military intelligence to work with local law enforcement in cases where lethal force might be an appropriate response. This means that the call on whether a local insurrection will end up as an all-out conflict between citizens and the US military ultimately rests in the hands of a civilian. Additionally, the US soldiers take their oaths to uphold the Constitution, not to obey their officers or the chain of command. If the US military or even the president makes an order that could be construed as going against the very nature of the Constitution, it's highly likely that soldiers are simply going to ignore it. Of course, there's also the matter of the chain of command being composed of the lawmakers themselves. Considering that there are entire swathes of lawyers who would hopefully advise the Secretary of Defense or the President on the best course of action at any given time, it's typically given that any direct order from the top of the chain is understood to be determined to be lawful, at least by the lawmakers' understanding at the time. Once a lawful order is given, the officers and soldiers are most likely to carry it out since it's a part of their duties. However, a countrywide insurrection against the government that has spiraled into a full-blown revolutionary war between civilians and the military is unlikely, but still based on Congress making the right kinds of decisions. But let's say that such an insurrection does happen, and that the US military actually follows the orders to crush it. What would be the result? Well, there's a lot of uncertainty in this scenario. First, it's unlikely that the insurrection would involve the entire country. In all likelihood, there will be pockets of anti-government resistance spread throughout the states, each requiring specific tactics for the US Army to counter them. In most conventional scenarios, civilians will have more guns, courtesy of a larger overall population, coupled with a relatively high gun ownership rate. However, between its vehicles, long-range equipment, electronic warfare capabilities, and drones, the US Army would have more firepower. If the insurrection spreads far enough and lasts long enough, civilians would no longer be able to get their hands on new weapons and equipment, as domestic production would peter out and the US military would control incoming trade. On the other hand, the US military still needs to get its money from somewhere. With a government that's not supported by its citizens, that budget would quickly drop, dragging down the military's ability to buy fuel for its vehicles, pay its soldiers, or trade for more equipment. As both sides continue fighting, the rest of the civilians caught in the crossfire are unlikely to continue supporting either of them. The insurgents are unlikely to be the majority of the population, and the soldiers might not want to kill a sizable percentage of their own people just to follow orders. If the fighting does continue, it could theoretically lead to US states dividing alongside ideological concepts, bringing forth the idea of secession, which is currently unconstitutional. However, the process of trying to modify the Constitution requires a vote supermajority in the House and the Senate, or state legislatures voting on it. This might be more difficult to achieve if parts of the country are in open rebellion against the government. But if the entire country goes against the US military, then that's probably a sign that the US would no longer exist in the same shape and form as it previously did. The societal collapse that would prompt all civilians to turn against the government that would be indicative of a failure on such a level that would be impossible to ignore. So the potential for the collapse would more likely be noticed much earlier and preempted, preventing the entire conflict in the first place. But who do you think would win in a conflict between the US military and civilians? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.